Sometimes life breaks you so completely that you forget what it feels like to hope. That's exactly where Jake Rourke found himself a widowed father, watching his world crumble piece by piece. Jake had lost everything that mattered. His wife was gone, his job was gone, and now he was about to lose custody of his 8-year-old daughter, Emma. All he had left was Ranger, his retired police dog who seemed to understand his pain. One afternoon, Ranger suddenly ran into an old abandoned farmhouse. Jake followed him inside, expecting to find nothing but dust and memories. Instead, he found something that would change everything. Hidden beneath the floorboards was a secret that had been buried for years. 12 missing children, alive but forgotten by a system that had given up on them. What Jake discovered in that basement would turn him from the town failure into an unlikely hero. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Rourke hadn't always been the town's cautionary tale. 3 years ago, he'd been Jake Rourke the foreman, the guy who could build anything with his hands and fix what others had given up on. He'd had calloused palms, a steady paycheck, and a wife who still laughed at his terrible jokes after 12 years of marriage. Most importantly, he'd had Sarah, beautiful, patient Sarah, who could calm his worst moods with a single look and who made their small rental house feel like a palace. The accident changed everything in the span of 17 seconds. Sarah had been driving home from her job at the county library when a drunk driver ran a red light. The impact killed her instantly, the state trooper had said, trying to offer comfort Jake couldn't accept. She didn't suffer, as if that somehow made the gaping hole in his chest hurt less. The grief came in waves that first year. Some days he could function, get Emma ready for school, pack her lunch, even manage a smile when she showed him her spelling tests. Other days, he couldn't get out of bed until he heard her small voice calling for him, reminding him that someone still needed him to be strong. Then came the drinking. It started innocent enough, a beer after Emma went to bed, something to quiet the thoughts that circled like vultures in his head. But one beer became 3, then 5, then whatever it took to make it through another night without Sarah's warmth beside him. He was functional at first, never drinking during the day, never in front of Emma. But grief has a way of demanding more space, and eventually even his ironclad rules began to bend. The morning he showed up to work with alcohol still on his breath was the morning Hendricks Construction let him go. 22 years of service, and it ended with a pink slip and Jerry Hendricks avoiding eye contact as he explained that they couldn't afford the liability. That's when Emma's grandparents swooped in. William and Margaret Harrison had never approved of their daughter's choice to marry a blue-collar man from the wrong side of town. They'd tolerated Jake when Sarah was alive, keeping their opinions to themselves out of respect for their daughter's happiness. But with Sarah gone and Jake spiraling, they saw an opportunity to correct what they'd always viewed as their daughter's mistake. The custody petition arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who couldn't meet Jake's eyes. Temporary guardianship, it said, pending a full custody hearing. The allegations were carefully worded but devastating. Alcohol abuse, financial instability, inability to provide adequate care for a minor child. The worst part was that some of it was true. Jake had been surviving on odd jobs and unemployment benefits. The electricity had been shut off twice. He'd missed parent-teacher conferences because he'd forgotten about them, lost in the fog of his grief. Emma had started making her own breakfast, because some mornings he simply couldn't drag himself out of bed in time. But he loved his daughter. That had never been in question. Emma Rose Rourke was 8 years old and possessed the kind of stubborn optimism that could break your heart if you weren't careful. She had Sarah's green eyes and Jake's determined chin, and she approached the world with a fearlessness that both terrified and amazed him. Even after losing her mother, even during the months when Jake was more ghost than father, Emma had maintained an unshakable faith that things would get better. She'd started drawing pictures of their family crayon sketches that showed the three of them together, always smiling, always holding hands. Sometimes she included Sarah as an angel watching over them. Sometimes she drew their old life when they'd been whole. Jake kept every single drawing in a shoebox under his bed, each one a reminder of what he was fighting for. The social worker assigned to their case was a kind woman named Patricia Valdez, who seemed genuinely invested in keeping families together when possible. She'd recommended counseling, regular check-ins, and a structured plan for Jake to demonstrate his commitment to sobriety and stability. But the Harrisons had money and connections, and they weren't interested in rehabilitation, they wanted custody. Judge William Harrison wasn't just Emma's grandfather. He was also the most respected judge in 3 counties, a man whose word carried the weight of absolute authority. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that the man trying to take his daughter away was also the one who would decide whether he deserved to keep her. That's when Ranger came into their lives. The German Shepherd had belonged to Officer Michael Torres, a canine handler who'd been killed in the line of duty 6 months earlier. The department had been looking for someone to adopt the 7-year-old dog, but most people weren't equipped to handle a retired police animal. Ranger needed someone who understood that he wasn't just a pet. He was a working dog with instincts and training that couldn't be turned off. When Patricia suggested that a companion animal might help with Emma's emotional stability, Jake had initially resisted. They could barely afford food for themselves, let alone a dog. But something about Ranger's steady gaze reminded him of Sarah's unwavering faith in people's capacity for goodness. The dog had arrived with a box of his belongings, his canine badge, service medals, training records, and a letter from Officer Torres's widow explaining Ranger's quirks and preferences. The badge was tarnished silver with K9 Ranger engraved in block letters, and Jake had found himself carrying it in his pocket like a talisman. It represented something he'd lost: purpose, duty, the knowledge that his actions mattered. Ranger adapted to their household with the patience of a saint. He seemed to understand that Emma needed gentle protection and that Jake needed a reason to get out of bed each morning. The dog's presence had a calming effect on them both, and for the first time since Sarah's death, their house felt like something approaching a home again. The people of Millbrook had long memories and short patience for second chances. Jake's fall from grace had been swift and public, documented in police reports and newspaper stories about his DUI arrest. The town that had once respected him as a skilled craftsman now saw him as a cautionary tale, the man who couldn't handle his grief and was raising his daughter in the wreckage of his former life. The local diner stopped offering him work. The hardware store clerk watched him carefully when he browsed the aisles. Even the mailman seemed to deliver his bills with a mixture of pity and disapproval. Jake had become invisible in the way that broken people often do, noticed only when his presence made others uncomfortable. But Emma didn't seem to notice or care about the whispered conversations that stopped when they walked into a room. She still held his hand at the grocery store, still asked him to check for monsters under her bed, still believed with absolute certainty that her daddy could fix anything that was wrong with the world. The custody hearing was scheduled for the following month, and Jake's court-appointed attorney had been brutally honest about their chances. The Harrisons had character witnesses, financial stability, and a compelling argument that Emma deserved better than a father who was still learning how to be sober. Jake's strongest defense was his love for his daughter, and as Patricia had gently explained, love alone wasn't always enough to win custody battles. So Jake did what he'd always done. When life got overwhelming, he took things one day at a time. He attended his AA meetings, kept detailed logs of his daily activities for the social worker, and tried to create some semblance of normal life for Emma. They had routines now: breakfast together every morning, walks with Ranger after school, bedtime stories that sometimes lasted an hour because Emma insisted on reading them herself. The old Whitmore farmhouse sat at the edge of town like a guilty secret nobody wanted to acknowledge. It had been abandoned for as long as Jake could remember, a relic from a time when Millbrook had been a farming community instead of a bedroom suburb for people who commuted to the city. The property had changed hands several times over the years, but nobody ever seemed to stay long. Local kids told stories about strange noises and flickering lights, but Jake had always assumed it was just the kind of folklore that grew up around any empty building. He'd driven past it countless times without giving it much thought. It was just part of the landscape, as permanent and unremarkable as the water tower or the old railroad bridge. But Ranger had always been interested in that direction during their walks, his ears perking up whenever they passed the overgrown driveway that led to the house. Jake should have paid more attention to those signs, should have trusted the instincts of a dog trained to detect things that human senses couldn't perceive. But he'd been too focused on the immediate crisis of potentially losing Emma to notice that Ranger's interest in the abandoned property was anything more than curiosity about the wildlife that probably lived in the overgrown fields. That afternoon would change everything. The afternoon when Ranger's training kicked in and he caught a scent that demanded investigation. The afternoon when Jake's world, already turned upside down by grief and legal battles, would be transformed in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Sometimes the universe has a way of putting the right person in the right place at exactly the right moment. Sometimes broken people are exactly what's needed to fix something that's been broken for much longer than they realize. The leash snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Jake had been walking Ranger along their usual route, the worn path that circled the outskirts of Millbrook and gave them both a chance to clear their heads. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September, the kind of day when the air carried the first hint of autumn and the light slanted golden through the trees. Emma was at school, and Jake had been using the quiet time to prepare for another meeting with his attorney. Ranger had been unusually alert during their walk, his ears constantly swiveling and his nose working overtime. Jake had attributed it to the changing season. Maybe there were deer in the area or raccoons getting ready for winter. The dog had always been more perceptive than most, but today his behavior bordered on agitated. They were passing the old Whitmore place when it happened. One moment Ranger was walking calmly beside him, and the next he was lunging forward with such force that the leather leash, already worn thin from years of use, simply gave way. "Ranger!" Jake called, but the dog was already disappearing through a gap in the rotted fence that surrounded the property. "Damn it, come back here." Jake stood there for a moment, staring at the broken leash in his hands. The metal clasp was still attached to his end, but the leather had torn clean through, where it had been weakened by time and weather. This was exactly the kind of thing that would look bad in a custody report. Man loses control of his dog, demonstrates inability to manage basic responsibilities. But he couldn't just leave Ranger. The dog meant everything to Emma, and losing him would devastate her. Jake pocketed the broken leash and followed the path his dog had taken, squeezing through the same gap in the fence. The Whitmore farmhouse loomed ahead of him, 2 stories of weathered wood and broken windows that seemed to watch his approach with hollow eyes. The wraparound porch sagged under the weight of accumulated neglect, and ivy had claimed most of the eastern wall. But it was the front door that stopped Jake cold. It was hanging open, creaking softly in the breeze. That door had been boarded up for as long as he could remember. "Ranger?" he called again, his voice lower now. The dog was nowhere to be seen, but Jake could hear something, a low, whining sound that seemed to be coming from inside the house. Jake approached the porch carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight on the rotted boards. The front door had indeed been boarded up once, but the plywood had been recently removed. Fresh scrape marks in the wood showed where a crowbar had been used, and the nails that had held the boards lay scattered on the porch floor. Someone had been here recently. Someone had opened this house. The whining sound came again, definitely from inside. Jake pushed the door open wider and stepped into what had once been the farmhouse's main room. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the broken windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stale air. The floor was covered with debris, chunks of fallen plaster, broken glass, and years of accumulated leaves that had blown in through the damaged walls. But there were other things too. Fresh footprints in the dust, empty food containers that hadn't been there long enough to fade, a blanket that looked recently used. "Ranger, where are you, boy?" The whining was coming from deeper in the house. Jake followed the sound through a doorway that led to what might have been a kitchen. The old appliances were gone, leaving only the marks on the wall where they'd once been connected. But there was something else, a sound beneath Ranger's whining that made Jake's blood run cold. Voices. Muffled and distant, but definitely human voices. Jake stood perfectly still, straining to listen. The voices were coming from below him, somewhere underneath the house. The whining was coming from the same direction, and now he could hear scratching sounds as well, Ranger pawing at something. There was a basement, and there were people in it. Jake found his dog in what had been the farmhouse's pantry, a small room off the kitchen where shelves had once held preserves and dry goods. Ranger was focused on a section of the floor, whining and pawing at the boards with an intensity that Jake had never seen before. "What is it, boy? What did you find?" Jake knelt beside the dog and examined the floor more closely. At first glance, it looked like the rest of the house, old wooden planks that had warped and separated over time. But when he looked more carefully, he could see that several of the boards were different, newer. And they weren't nailed down like the others, they were loose, designed to be moved. The voices came again, clearer now. Children's voices, speaking in hushed tones that carried the unmistakable weight of fear. Jake's hands shook as he pried up the loose boards. Beneath them was a wooden ladder leading down into darkness. The voices stopped abruptly, as if the people below had heard him moving around above them. "Hello?" Jake called down into the darkness. "Is someone down there?" Silence. Ranger's whining became more urgent, and he started down the ladder before Jake could stop him. The dog's claws clicked against the wooden rungs as he descended into whatever lay beneath the farmhouse. Jake pulled out his phone to use as a flashlight and followed his dog into the darkness. The basement was larger than it should have been, extending well beyond the footprint of the house above. The walls were rough stone, and the air smelled of damp earth and something else, something human and afraid. Jake's phone light cut through the darkness, revealing a space that had been converted into living quarters. There were mattresses on the floor, dozens of them arranged in rows like a makeshift dormitory, blankets and pillows that looked recently used, buckets that served as makeshift toilets. And in the far corner, huddled together like frightened animals, were 12 children. They ranged in age from perhaps 6 to 14, boys and girls of different races and backgrounds. Their clothes were dirty but not ragged, their faces pale from lack of sunlight but not gaunt from hunger. They stared at Jake with eyes that had seen too much, and when he took a step toward them, they pressed themselves further into the corner. "It's okay," Jake said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Jake, and this is Ranger. We're here to help." One of the children, a girl who couldn't have been more than 10, spoke in a voice so quiet Jake had to strain to hear her. "Are you with them?" "No," Jake said, slowly lowering himself to a crouch so he wouldn't seem so threatening. "I don't know who them is, but I'm not with anyone. I was just walking my dog and he led me here." Ranger had positioned himself between Jake and the children, his body language calm but alert. The dog seemed to understand that these were victims, not threats, and his presence appeared to have a calming effect on the kids. "We're going to get you out of here," Jake said. "But first I need to call the police. Is that okay?" The same girl shook her head frantically. "They said the police couldn't help us. They said nobody would believe us." "Well, they were wrong," Jake said firmly. "The police are going to believe me, and they're going to believe you. And we're going to make sure whoever did this to you pays for it." Jake's hands were shaking as he dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, he tried to keep his voice steady, but the words came out in a rush. "This is Jake Rourke. I'm at the old Whitmore farmhouse on County Road 47. I've found children here, 12 children who I think have been kidnapped. They're alive, but they're scared. You need to send police and ambulances right away." The dispatcher asked him to repeat the information, then told him to stay on the line and not to move the children until help arrived. Jake sat down on the basement floor and waited, talking quietly to the children and trying to reassure them that help was coming. It was Ranger who heard the cars first, his ears perking up at the sound of vehicles approaching the house. Within minutes, Jake could hear footsteps above them and voices calling his name. "Down here," he shouted. "We're in the basement." The first officer down the ladder was a woman Jake didn't recognize, probably from the county sheriff's department. She took one look at the scene and immediately called for backup and medical personnel. More officers followed, along with paramedics who began checking the children for injuries. Jake found himself pushed to the side as professionals took over the scene. He watched as the children were carefully coaxed out of their corner and led up the ladder to waiting ambulances. They moved like people who had forgotten what sunlight felt like, blinking and squinting as they emerged from their underground prison. The last child up the ladder was the girl who had spoken to him first. As she passed Jake, she stopped and looked back at him. "Thank you," she whispered. Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He followed her up the ladder, Ranger close behind him, and emerged into a scene of controlled chaos. Police cars and ambulances filled the farmhouse's overgrown yard, their red and blue lights painting the afternoon in urgent colors. Detective Sarah Chen, a small woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority, approached Jake as he stood watching the children being loaded into ambulances. "Mr. Rourke, I'm going to need to ask you some questions about how you found this place." Jake nodded, pulling the broken leash from his pocket. "It started with this," he said, holding up the torn leather. "Ranger broke free and ran straight here. I followed him, and he led me right to that basement." Detective Chen examined the broken leash, then looked at Ranger, who was sitting calmly at Jake's side, despite all the commotion around them. "You said this is a retired canine?" "Yes, ma'am. He belonged to Officer Torres before." Jake stopped, the implications hitting him. "You think he smelled something?" "I think," Detective Chen said carefully, "that you and your dog just saved 12 lives, and I think this is going to be a much bigger case than any of us realized." As the ambulances pulled away, carrying the children to safety, Jake stood in the shadow of the Whitmore farmhouse and tried to process what had just happened. This morning he'd been a struggling single father, facing a custody battle he was likely to lose. Tonight, he was the man who had discovered 12 missing children that the system had given up for dead. The broken leash lay forgotten in the dirt at his feet, the moment when his controlled life had spiraled into something much larger than himself. He looked down at Ranger, who was watching the departing vehicles with the calm attention of a professional who had just completed a successful mission. "Good boy," Jake said quietly, scratching behind the dog's ears. "You knew, didn't you? You knew they were down there." Ranger looked up at him with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold secrets Jake was only beginning to understand. The children's names were written in careful block letters on the first page of a composition notebook that had been torn in half. Someone had used a blue crayon to write "My Diary" on the cover, and inside, a child's handwriting documented days and weeks of captivity with the matter-of-fact resilience that children possess in the face of unthinkable circumstances. Detective Chen found the diary hidden beneath one of the mattresses in the basement, and she shared selected passages with Jake as they sat in the Millbrook Police Department 3 hours after the rescue. The station had been transformed into a command center, with FBI agents setting up computers and phone lines while social workers prepared to interview the children once they'd been medically cleared. Tuesday, they brought us new books today. Sarah chose Charlotte's Web and Marcus wanted the one about dinosaurs. I'm saving the last cookie for when Amy feels better. Friday, Amy's fever is gone. We played the quiet game for 2 hours. Marcus made us all laugh when he pretended to be an elephant. Monday, the nice lady came back. She brought us vitamins and said we were being very brave. I asked if my mum knows where I am. She said yes, but looked sad. Jake had to stop reading. The matter-of-fact way the child had documented their imprisonment, finding small joys and looking out for the younger ones, was almost harder to bear than if the entries had been filled with despair. "How long were they down there?" he asked Detective Chen. "Based on the diary entries and what we've been able to get from the children so far, some of them have been missing for over 2 years. The youngest ones might not even remember their lives before this." The hospital had been cautious about releasing details, but the initial medical exams had revealed children who were malnourished but not starving, frightened but not physically abused in the ways that Jake had been afraid to imagine. Someone had been keeping them alive and relatively healthy, which raised questions that made his stomach turn. "What were they being kept for?" Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Detective Chen's expression was carefully neutral. "We're still investigating. But Mr. Rourke, I need you to understand something. This case is going to be big. National news big. These children have been missing from multiple states, and some of them were taken from right here in town. The media attention is going to be intense, and your life is about to change in ways you can't imagine." Jake thought about Emma, who was spending the evening with Patricia Valdez, while he dealt with the immediate aftermath of the discovery. His daughter didn't know yet what had happened, only that Daddy had found some children who needed help and had to talk to the police. "What do I need to do?" "Right now, we need you to walk us through everything that happened today, minute by minute. Then we'll need you to stay available in case we have follow-up questions. The FBI is going to want to interview you as well." The statement Jake gave took 2 hours. He described the walk with Ranger, the broken leash, the decision to follow the dog onto the property. He explained finding the open door, hearing the voices from below, discovering the loose floorboards. Every detail was recorded and cross-referenced, turned into evidence in what Detective Chen assured him would be a massive investigation. Agent Michelle Torres, no relation to Ranger's former handler despite the shared name, arrived from the FBI field office as Jake was finishing his statement. She was a woman in her early 40s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen enough human cruelty to last several lifetimes. "Mr. Rourke, I understand you've had a long day, but I need to ask you about your dog." Jake looked over at Ranger, who had been allowed to stay in the interview room and was currently lying at Jake's feet with the patience of a professional waiting for his next assignment. "What about him?" His training records show that he was specialized in locating missing persons. His handler, Officer Torres, used him primarily for search and rescue operations involving children. The pieces clicked together in Jake's mind. "You think he smelled the children from outside the house?" "I think your dog's nose detected something that human senses couldn't perceive, and his training kicked in. The question is, how long has he been alerting to that property?" Jake thought back to their walks over the past few months, remembering how Ranger's attention had always seemed drawn to the direction of the farmhouse. "He's always been interested in that area. I just thought it was wildlife." Agent Torres made a note. "We're going to need to examine that property thoroughly. If children were being held there for years, there may be evidence that leads us to other locations, other victims. This could be part of a much larger operation." The implications were staggering. Jake had stumbled onto something that could potentially save more lives than just the 12 children they'd found today. By the time Jake was finally allowed to leave the police station, it was nearly midnight. Patricia Valdez had taken Emma to her own home for the night, and Jake's house felt impossibly empty when he walked through the door. Ranger immediately went to his water bowl and drank deeply, as if the day's work had taken more out of him than he'd let on. Jake sat on his couch and tried to process what had happened. This morning, he'd been a failed father facing a custody battle. Tonight, he was being called a hero by people who'd never spoken to him before. His phone had been ringing constantly with calls from reporters who'd somehow gotten his number, and Detective Chen had warned him that by tomorrow morning, news vans would probably be parked outside his house. But all he could think about were those children's faces, the way they'd huddled together in the corner, protecting each other in the only way they could. The careful handwriting in that torn diary, documenting small kindnesses and quiet courage in the face of unimaginable circumstances. The next morning brought exactly what Detective Chen had predicted. Jake woke to find 3 news vans parked across the street from his house, their satellite dishes pointed toward the sky, like mechanical flowers reaching for the sun. Reporters with perfect hair and serious expressions were setting up cameras on his sidewalk. Emma was still at Patricia's, which Jake was grateful for. He called the social worker to explain what had happened and to arrange for Emma to stay away from the house until the media attention died down. "Jake," Patricia said, her voice carefully measured, "this changes things with the custody case." "How so?" "Judge Harrison is going to have a hard time arguing that you're an unfit parent when you just saved 12 children. The national attention alone is going to make this case much more visible, and that's not always comfortable for people in his position." Jake hadn't even thought about the custody battle in the midst of everything else that was happening. But Patricia was right, it was hard to paint someone as a danger to children when they'd just rescued a dozen of them from a basement prison. His phone rang. "Detective Chen." "Mr. Rourke, we need you to come back in. The children are starting to talk, and several of them are asking for you. Specifically, they're asking for the man with the dog." An hour later, Jake and Ranger walked into Millbrook General Hospital's pediatric wing. The children had been kept together as much as possible, occupying an entire floor that had been cleared of other patients for security reasons. FBI agents stood at the elevators and stationed themselves in the hallways, their presence both reassuring and ominous. Dr. Amanda Foster, the hospital's chief pediatrician, met Jake at the nurses' station. "Mr. Rourke, these children have been through an ordeal that most of us can't imagine. They're exhibiting classic signs of trauma, hypervigilance, difficulty trusting adults, reluctance to be separated from each other. But several of them have specifically mentioned you and your dog. They seem to view you as someone safe." Jake followed Dr. Foster down the hallway to a large room that had been converted into a communal space. The 12 children were there, some in hospital beds, others sitting in chairs or on the floor. They looked different in the bright hospital lighting, smaller somehow, and younger. But when they saw Jake and Ranger enter the room, several of them smiled for the first time since the rescue. The girl who had spoken to him in the basement, Jake learned her name was Lucy Morrison, and she'd been missing from Portland, Oregon for 8 months, approached him with the same careful courage she'd shown underground. "Is Ranger going to stay with us?" she asked. "He'll stay as long as you want him to," Jake said, kneeling down so he was at her eye level. "He likes taking care of people." As if to prove the point, Ranger moved slowly around the room, allowing each child to pet him. The dog seemed to understand that these were fragile humans who needed gentle handling, and his presence had an immediately calming effect on the children's anxiety. Dr. Foster pulled Jake aside. "I've never seen anything like this. These children have been resistant to most of our attempts to help them, but they trust you. Would you be willing to stay for a while? Your presence might help us get the information we need to find whoever did this to them." Jake spent the next 4 hours in that hospital room, listening as the children slowly began to share their stories. They spoke in fragments and whispers, their accounts pieced together like a puzzle that revealed the scope of their captivity. They had been taken from different places at different times, playgrounds, school buses, even from their own backyards. Most remembered being approached by a woman who seemed kind and trustworthy, someone who offered help or asked for directions. Then there was nothing until they woke up in the basement. The woman visited them regularly, bringing food and books and medicine when they were sick. She never hurt them, but she made it clear that they couldn't leave. She told them their families thought they were dead, that no one was looking for them anymore. Some of the older children remembered other kids who had been in the basement before, children who had been taken away and never came back. The woman always said they'd been adopted by nice families, but the children weren't stupid. They knew that wasn't true. "How many others were there?" Jake asked gently. Lucy looked around at the other children, as if checking to make sure it was okay to answer. "Maybe 20? Over the time I was there. They came and went. 20 children, possibly more, over a period of years." Jake felt sick thinking about what might have happened to the ones who'd been taken away from the basement. As the day wore on, Jake began to understand that his role in this case was far from over. The children trusted him in a way they didn't trust the other adults, and that trust was going to be crucial in building the case against whoever had held them captive. But more than that, Jake was beginning to realize that saving these children might be the thing that saved him too. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like his life had purpose beyond just surviving until the next day. When he finally left the hospital that evening, Lucy Morrison pressed something into his hand. It was a page torn from the diary they'd found in the basement, with a drawing on it of a man and a dog standing in a beam of sunlight. "That's you and Ranger," she said. "You're the light that found us in the dark." Jake folded the paper carefully and put it in his wallet next to one of Emma's drawings of their family. Some pictures, he thought, were worth keeping forever. The photograph was tucked between the pages of an old phone book in a box Jake had never bothered to unpack. He'd been looking for Sarah's birth certificate, something the FBI needed for their expanding investigation, when his fingers brushed against the faded edge of the picture. It showed the Whitmore farmhouse as it had been 30 years ago, when it was still a working farm. The wraparound porch was painted white and lined with rocking chairs. Children played in a yard that was green and well-maintained, and standing on the front steps, smiling at the camera, was a girl who looked exactly like Sarah. Jake stared at the photograph for a long time, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Sarah had never mentioned living in Millbrook as a child. She'd grown up in foster care, she'd told him, bouncing between different families in different towns. She'd always been vague about the details, changing the subject whenever he asked too many questions about her childhood. But here she was, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing in front of the same house where 12 children had been held captive for years. Jake's hands shook as he turned the photograph over. In Sarah's careful handwriting, someone had written, "Summer 1994. The last good place." Detective Chen arrived at Jake's house 20 minutes after he called her. She examined the photograph with the same careful attention she'd given every other piece of evidence in the case. "You're certain this is your wife? I'd know her anywhere," Jake said. "But Chen, she never told me she'd lived here. She said she didn't remember much about her childhood, that foster care had been hard, and she preferred not to talk about it." Detective Chen was quiet for a long moment, studying the photograph. "Mr. Rourke, we've been operating under the assumption that this trafficking operation was relatively recent, but if your wife was at that house 30 years ago, and if she was in foster care..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Jake could see where her thoughts were leading, and it made him feel sick. "You think she was a victim? I think we need to look deeper into the history of that property, and I think we need to understand why your wife never told you about her connection to this place." The Millbrook County Records Office was housed in the basement of the courthouse, a maze of filing cabinets and dusty ledgers that documented decades of property transfers, birth certificates, and legal proceedings. Jake sat at a table covered with manila folders, while Detective Chen worked her way through the ownership history of the Whitmore farmhouse. The property was owned by the Whitmore family from 1952 to 1987, Chen said, reading from a thick folder. Then it was sold to something called the Millbrook Children's Foundation. What's that? According to these records, it was a private organization that provided temporary housing for children in state custody. A group home. Essentially, Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Sarah was there as a foster child. Chen continued reading. The foundation operated the property as a residential facility from 1987 to 1995. Then there was some kind of investigation, child welfare violations, allegations of improper supervision. The state pulled their license, and the children were relocated to other facilities. What happened to the foundation? It dissolved. The property sat empty for a few years, then was sold to a development company that never did anything with it. It's been abandoned ever since. But Jake was thinking about the photograph, about the date written on the back. Chen, if the investigation was in 1995, and Sarah wrote Summer 1994 on that picture. She was there right before it all fell apart. Mr. Rourke, I think your wife might have been one of the children who reported the abuse. They found the old case files in a storage room that smelled of mildew and forgotten paperwork. The investigation into the Millbrook Children's Foundation had been thorough, but ultimately inconclusive. Several children had reported inappropriate behavior by staff members, but the allegations were hard to prove, and the children were considered unreliable witnesses. Sarah's name was in the files. Sarah Elizabeth Henderson, she'd used her foster name before they were married, had been 12 years old when she was interviewed by investigators. Her statement was brief and formal, but it painted a picture of a facility where children were neglected and sometimes worse. Some of the older kids disappeared, she'd told the investigator. They said they got adopted, but we never heard from them again. And there were people who came at night sometimes, people who weren't supposed to be there. Jake read his wife's words from 30 years ago and felt like he was seeing her for the first time. The woman he'd married had been a survivor, someone who'd escaped something terrible and built a new life for herself. But she'd never felt safe enough to tell him the truth about where she'd come from. "There's more," Detective Chen said, pointing to another document in the file. "Look at this list of children who were at the facility." Jake scanned the names, and his blood ran cold. There, in the middle of the list, was Lucy Morrison. "That's impossible," Jake said. "Lucy is 10 years old. She couldn't have been there 30 years ago." Chen was already flipping through more papers. "Not Lucy Morrison, the child we rescued. Lucy Morrison, the staff member. She was 19 in 1994, hired as a caregiver's assistant." The pieces were falling into place in a way that made Jake's stomach turn. "You think she's the woman who was keeping the children?" "I think we need to find Lucy Morrison, the adult Lucy Morrison, and ask her some very serious questions." But when they ran the name through the system, they discovered that Lucy Morrison had died in a car accident in 1998, 3 years after the children's home closed. Her death certificate was signed by Dr. Margaret Harrison, Emma's grandmother, who had been the county coroner before she retired. Jake stared at the death certificate, pieces of a puzzle clicking together in his mind. Chen, Emma's grandparents, Judge Harrison and his wife. They've been involved in this county's child welfare system for decades. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that maybe the reason they want custody of Emma isn't just about disapproving of me. Maybe they're trying to control what I might find out." Detective Chen was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Rourke, these are serious allegations. Judge Harrison is one of the most respected people in this county. So was the Millbrook Children's Foundation, apparently, right up until children started disappearing." That evening, Jake sat on his couch with Emma, who had finally been allowed to come home now that the initial media frenzy had died down. She was drawing again another picture of their family, but this one included Ranger, sitting proudly beside them. "Daddy, are you famous now?" Emma asked, coloring Ranger's fur with a brown crayon. "I don't know about famous, sweetheart. I just helped some kids who needed help. Like how Mummy used to help kids at the library." Jake paused in his review of the case files Chen had copied for him. "What do you mean?" "Mummy always said the library was a safe place for kids who didn't have safe places at home. She said some kids needed somewhere to go after school where grown-ups would be nice to them." It was such a simple observation, but it made Jake think about Sarah in a new way. She dedicated her life to creating safe spaces for children because she knew what it was like to be a child who wasn't safe. Every story time she'd organized, every after-school program she'd supervised, had been her way of protecting other kids from what she'd experienced. "Emma, did Mummy ever talk about when she was little?" Emma shook her head. She said some things were too sad to talk about, but that they made her want to help other kids be happy. Jake looked down at the photograph of young Sarah standing in front of the Whitmore farmhouse. She'd escaped that place and built a beautiful life, had a daughter who felt safe and loved every day. But she'd never forgotten where she came from, and somehow, even after her death, she was still protecting children. The broken leash that had started this whole chain of events was sitting on Jake's coffee table. He picked it up and examined the frayed leather, thinking about the moment when Ranger had pulled so hard that it snapped. It was as if the dog had known that something was more important than staying safe and controlled. Maybe that's what courage was, knowing when it was time to break free from the things that held you back and run toward the places where you were needed most. His phone buzzed with a text from Detective Chen. "Need to see you first thing tomorrow. We found something else." Jake looked at Emma, who was adding hearts around their family portrait, completely unaware that her father was becoming the center of an investigation that reached back decades. He thought about Sarah's hidden past and Judge Harrison's attempts to gain custody and the 12 children who trusted him to help them find justice. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, new pieces of a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex every day. But tonight, Jake was content to sit with his daughter and watch her color their family back together, one crayon stroke at a time. Ranger lifted his head from where he'd been dozing and looked toward the window. His ears were alert, his body tense in the way that meant he'd sensed something. But after a moment, he relaxed and put his head back down. Whatever he'd detected wasn't a threat. Jake scratched behind the dog's ears and wondered what other secrets Ranger might be carrying, what other connections he might reveal in the days to come. The photograph of young Sarah seemed to watch him from the coffee table, a reminder that the past had a way of reaching into the present when you least expected it. Some truths, Jake was learning, were worth waiting 30 years to discover. Sarah's letters were hidden in a shoebox behind the water heater in their basement, wrapped in plastic and tied with the same blue ribbon she'd used to bind their wedding invitations. Jake found them after Detective Chen suggested he search through Sarah's belongings more thoroughly, looking for anything that might explain her connection to the Whitmore farmhouse. There were dozens of letters, all addressed to him but never sent. The earliest was dated just 2 weeks after their first date, written in Sarah's careful script on library letterhead. "Dear Jake," it began, "there are things about my past that I want to tell you, but I don't know how. I'm afraid that if you knew where I came from, you might not want to stay." Jake sat on the basement floor reading by the light of a bare bulb, Ranger curled up beside him as if the dog understood the gravity of what they'd discovered. Letter after letter revealed pieces of Sarah's story that she'd never been able to share out loud. She wrote about the Millbrook Children's Foundation with the careful distance of someone who'd survived trauma but hadn't fully processed it. She described the staff members who'd been kind and the ones who'd made her skin crawl. She wrote about the children who'd disappeared in the middle of the night and how the remaining kids were told never to ask questions. But it was a letter dated 3 months before Emma's birth that made Jake's blood run cold. "I've been having nightmares again," Sarah had written. "Dreams about the basement under the house, about the children who were taken away. I keep thinking about Lucy Morrison, how she tried to protect us even though she was barely more than a child herself. She knew something was wrong, but she was too young and scared to know what to do about it. The worst part is that I think some of the people involved are still here, still in positions of power." Judge Harrison was on the board of directors for the foundation. His wife was the one who signed the medical reports for the children who got sick and had to be transferred to other facilities. I see them around town sometimes, and they always smile and wave like we're old friends, like they don't remember what they allowed to happen. I'm terrified that having a baby will make me a target again. What if they think I know too much? What if they try to take Emma away from us? I keep all the doors locked at night, and I've been thinking about moving somewhere far away from here. But I don't want to run anymore. I want Emma to have a normal childhood, to feel safe in the world. Sometimes I think about telling you everything, but then I imagine the look in your eyes when you realize you married someone who's damaged. Someone who came from a place where children weren't protected. I couldn't bear it if you looked at me differently. Jake had to stop reading. His hands were shaking, and he felt like he couldn't breathe. Sarah had been afraid of the people who'd hurt her as a child, of losing Emma, of losing him. She'd carried these secrets alone for their entire marriage, protecting him from a truth she thought might destroy their happiness. But there were more letters, written after Emma's birth. She's perfect, Jake. When I hold her, I can almost forget about the darkness I came from. She makes me believe that good things are possible, that children can be safe and loved and protected. I've been thinking about Lucy Morrison again, the real Lucy, not the woman they said died in that car accident. I don't believe she's dead. I think they made her disappear because she knew too much, because she was going to expose what was really happening at the foundation. I've been doing research at the library, looking through old newspaper archives and public records. There's a pattern of children going missing in this county, going back decades. Not just from the foundation, but from foster homes and troubled families. Children that the system wrote off as runaways. Judge Harrison has been involved in family court for 30 years. His wife worked for the state's Child Protective Services before she became coroner. They've had access to vulnerable children for their entire careers. What if the Millbrook Children's Foundation wasn't closed because of abuse? What if it was closed to cover up something much worse? Jake set the letter down and reached for his phone to call Detective Chen, but before he could dial, his doorbell rang. Through the basement window, he could see police cars in his driveway. Detective Chen was at his front door, but she wasn't alone. Agent Torres from the FBI was with her, along with 2 other federal agents Jake didn't recognize. "Mr. Rourke, we need to talk," Chen said. "We've made some arrests, and the situation is more complicated than we initially thought." They sat in Jake's living room, while Emma played in her bedroom upstairs, unaware that her father's world was shifting again. Agent Torres pulled out a tablet and showed Jake a series of photographs, mugshots of people he recognized from around town. "Margaret Harrison was arrested 3 hours ago," Torres said, "along with 5 other individuals connected to the old Millbrook Children's Foundation. We found evidence in her home that links her to the trafficking operation." Jake stared at the photograph of Emma's grandmother. Margaret Harrison looked older and more fragile than he remembered, but her eyes held the same cold calculation he'd always seen when she looked at him. "What kind of evidence?" "Financial records showing payments to Lucy Morrison continuing for years after her supposed death. Medical supplies, consistent with keeping children sedated for transport. And most damning, a list of children taken from various facilities over the past 20 years. Detective Chen leaned forward. "Mr. Rourke, we believe your wife was targeted specifically because of what she knew about the foundation. Her marriage to you, moving to this town, starting a family here, it kept her close enough for them to monitor." "You think they killed her?" "The accident that killed your wife is being reinvestigated. The drunk driver who hit her had no memory of that night. Blood tests showed he'd been drugged with the same sedatives we found in Margaret Harrison's house." Jake felt like the room was spinning. Sarah hadn't died in a random accident. She'd been murdered to keep her quiet about what she'd witnessed as a child. Agent Torres continued, showing him photographs. "We've also arrested Judge Harrison. The custody case against you was part of a larger plan to gain control of Emma." "Why would they want Emma?" "Because you were getting too close to the truth. If they had custody of your daughter, they could control you. Make sure you didn't ask too many questions about the connection between the children you found and the old foundation." Jake thought about the letters Sarah had written but never sent, her fears about being targeted because of what she knew. She'd been right to be afraid. The people who'd hurt her as a child had been watching her entire adult life, waiting for the right moment to silence her permanently. "There's something else," Detective Chen said gently. "The woman who was caring for the children in the basement, the one they knew as the nice lady, we have her in custody. Her name is Lucy Morrison, and she's very much alive." I thought. The Lucy Morrison who died in 1998 was someone else entirely, someone whose identity was stolen to create a cover story. The real Lucy Morrison has been operating under false identities for decades, moving children through a network that spans multiple states. Jake tried to process what he was being told. So the woman the children trusted, the one who brought them food and books, she was part of the trafficking ring? It's more complicated than that. Lucy Morrison was a victim who became a perpetrator, someone who convinced herself she was protecting the children by keeping them safe and fed while they were being moved through the system. She's agreed to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. What does she know about Sarah? Agent Torres and Detective Chen exchanged a look. She says your wife was the one child she couldn't save from the Foundation. Sarah had started asking too many questions, connecting patterns that the other children missed. Lucy tried to warn her to stop, but Sarah was determined to expose what was happening. When the investigation shut down the Foundation in 1995, Sarah was transferred to a different facility outside the county. Lucy thought she was safe. But the network had long reach, and they never forgot about the girl who'd almost exposed them. Jake stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where media vans had been parked just days earlier. Everything he'd thought he knew about his life was wrong. His marriage, Sarah's death, the custody battle, it was all connected to events that had begun decades before he'd even met his wife. What happens now? "Now we build a case that will put these people away forever," Agent Torres said. "But we need your help. The children trust you, and Lucy Morrison specifically asked to speak with you. She says she has information about other victims, other locations where children might be held." "She wants to see me?" "She says she owes it to Sarah to tell someone the whole truth, and she thinks you're the only person who might understand why she did what she did." Jake looked up at the ceiling, thinking about Emma playing in her room above them. His daughter was safe now, but there were other children out there who weren't. Other families being torn apart by people who saw children as commodities rather than human beings. He thought about Sarah's letters, about her fear that she was damaged goods, unworthy of love because of where she'd come from. She'd been wrong about that. Her past had made her stronger, more compassionate, more determined to protect others. And now it was Jake's turn to continue what she'd started. "When do we meet with Lucy Morrison?" Detective Chen smiled. "Tomorrow morning. Mr. Rourke, your wife would be proud of what you're doing." Jake nodded, but he was thinking about something else Sarah had written in one of her letters. "Sometimes the people who've been broken are the only ones who know how to fix what's been shattered." He was beginning to understand what she meant. The silver locket was no bigger than a quarter, tarnished with age and wrapped in tissue paper at the bottom of Sarah's jewelry box. Jake had searched through her belongings countless times since her death, but he'd never noticed the small package tucked beneath the velvet lining. Inside the locket was a photograph so tiny he had to squint to make out the details. It showed two young girls standing together, arms around each other's shoulders. One was clearly Sarah, maybe 11 or 12 years old. The other girl was unfamiliar, but something about her eyes reminded Jake of someone he'd seen recently. On the back of the locket, an address was engraved in letters so small they were barely readable. 847 Pine Ridge Road, Millbrook. Jake had lived in Millbrook for 15 years, but he'd never heard of Pine Ridge Road. When he looked it up online, he discovered it was in the oldest part of town, a residential area that had been declining for decades. Most of the houses there were either abandoned or converted into low-income apartments. Detective Chen met him at the address an hour later. Number 847 was a two-story Victorian house that had seen better days. The paint was peeling, the front porch sagged, and several windows were boarded up. But there were signs of recent habitation: a car in the driveway, curtains in the upstairs windows, a small garden that had been tended with care. According to county records, this house belongs to a woman named Margaret Foster, Chen said. She's lived here for about 15 years. The name meant nothing to Jake, but when the front door opened, he recognized the woman immediately. She was one of the adult survivors he'd met during the investigation, someone who'd been at the Millbrook Children's Foundation around the same time as Sarah. Margaret Foster was in her 40s now, with graying brown hair and eyes that held the same wariness Jake had seen in all the survivors. But when she saw the locket in his hand, her expression shifted to something that looked like relief. "You found it," she said simply. "I was wondering when someone would." She invited them into a living room that was clean but sparse, furnished with the kind of second-hand furniture that spoke of careful budgeting and simple needs. Photographs lined the mantelpiece, pictures of Margaret with various children of different ages, all smiling and well cared for. "Sarah gave me that locket the night before she left the foundation," Margaret said, settling into a worn armchair. "She said if anything ever happened to her, I should make sure someone knew about the others." "What others?" Detective Chen asked. Margaret gestured to the photographs on the mantelpiece. "The ones who got away." Sarah wasn't the only child who escaped that place with information that could have brought them down. There were 5 of us who saw too much, who started asking questions. They couldn't make us all disappear without raising suspicions, so they scattered us to different facilities and hoped we'd forget. Jake studied the photographs more closely. The children in them ranged from toddlers to teenagers, and they clearly spanned several decades of Margaret's life. "Are these your children?" Margaret smiled sadly. "In every way that matters. I've been running an unofficial safe house here for 20 years. Kids who age out of the foster system with nowhere to go, runaways who don't trust the official shelters, teenagers who've been trafficked and need somewhere to heal. I can't save them all, but I can save some." Detective Chen leaned forward. "Margaret, we need to know what you remember about the foundation, specifically about the people who were running it." "Judge Harrison and his wife weren't just on the board of directors," Margaret said. "They were the architects of the whole operation. They used their positions in the family court system to identify vulnerable children, kids with no family, no advocates, no one who would ask too many questions if they disappeared." She stood up and pulled a photo album from a bookshelf, flipping through pages of newspaper clippings and official documents. "I've been documenting this for years, building a case that no one wanted to hear. Children who were declared dead after running away, only to surface in other states months later. Foster families who took in multiple children, but only reported some of them to social services. Medical records that showed children being treated for injuries they couldn't have sustained in the facilities where they were supposedly living." Jake looked at page after page of evidence that painted a picture of systematic abuse and trafficking that had been going on for decades. "Why didn't you go to the police?" "I tried, multiple times, but Judge Harrison had connections everywhere. Police chiefs, prosecutors, even FBI agents, they all owed him favors or had worked cases with him. My allegations were dismissed as the fantasies of a troubled former foster child with mental health issues." Detective Chen was photographing pages from the album with her phone. "This is incredible documentation, Margaret. Why are you sharing it now?" "Because Sarah's dead, and her daughter is in danger. The Harrisons don't just want custody of Emma, they want to make sure no one ever connects the dots between what happened 30 years ago and what's happening now." Margaret flipped to a section of the album that made Jake's stomach drop. It contained photographs of children who had been at the foundation, official photos from their state files, the kind taken when they entered the system. But these photos had been marked with red X's, and dates had been written beside each one. "These are the children who didn't make it out," Margaret said quietly. 23 kids over an 8-year period. The official records say they were transferred to other facilities or ran away, but I know better. Jake found Sarah's photo in the group, unmarked by red ink. Beside it was the photo of the other girl from the locket, a child named Amy Carter, whose picture bore a red X and a date from 1994. Amy was Sarah's roommate, Margaret explained. They were inseparable, like sisters. When the investigation started getting serious, Amy was one of the first children to be transferred. Sarah was supposed to go with her, but there was a paperwork delay. By the time they came for Sarah, the whole operation was shutting down. What happened to Amy? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I think she was killed, along with most of the others. They couldn't risk letting children who'd witnessed the trafficking operation live to testify. Detective Chen was on her phone, calling for backup and forensic teams. The evidence Margaret had collected was enough to reopen dozens of missing persons cases and potentially identify locations where bodies might be buried. But Jake was thinking about something else. Margaret, how did you know about Emma being in danger? Because 3 weeks ago, someone broke into my house. Nothing was stolen, but all my files had been searched. Then I got a phone call from a woman who said I needed to stop asking questions about the past, or other people I cared about might have accidents like Sarah did. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The Harrisons knew you were still investigating. They've been monitoring all of us survivors for years, making sure we didn't get too close to the truth. But when you found those children in the basement, everything changed. Suddenly there was too much attention, too many questions. They got desperate. Margaret pulled out a cell phone and showed them a text message from an unknown number. The man with the dog needs to stop digging, or his daughter will disappear just like the others. I got this yesterday, Margaret said. I think they're planning to take Emma. Detective Chen was already calling for protective custody, while Jake's mind raced through the implications. The custody battle had never been about Emma's welfare. It had been about control. The Harrisons needed to neutralize Jake's ability to investigate, and taking his daughter was the most effective way to do that. We need to get Emma somewhere safe, Jake said. She's already being moved to a secure location, Chen assured him. But Jake, this changes everything. We're not just dealing with a historical trafficking case anymore. These people are actively threatening you and your daughter. Margaret stood up and went to a window, peering through the curtains at the street outside. There's something else you need to know. The network didn't end when the foundation closed. It just evolved. Lucy Morrison, the real Lucy Morrison, has been running children through houses all over the region for decades. The basement where you found those 12 kids was just one location. She handed Jake a list of addresses written in Sarah's handwriting. Sarah was investigating these places before she died. She'd been tracking missing children reports and matching them to properties owned by shell companies connected to the Harrisons. Jake recognized several of the addresses, abandoned houses and commercial buildings around Millbrook that he'd driven past hundreds of times without thinking twice about them. How many children are we talking about? Based on Sarah's research and my own investigation, potentially hundreds over the past 30 years. Some were moved through quickly, trafficked to buyers in other states. Others were held for longer periods, used for different purposes. Detective Chen finished her phone calls and turned back to them. Margaret, we're going to need you to come with us. Your testimony and documentation are crucial to this case. But first, we need to make sure you're safe. As they prepared to leave the house, Margaret picked up one of the photographs from the mantelpiece, a recent picture of a teenage girl with bright eyes and a hopeful smile. This is Jessica, she said. She came to me 6 months ago, after escaping from a situation similar to what those 12 children experienced. She's been helping me research the connection between current missing children cases and the old foundation records. Jake looked at the photograph, seeing something familiar in the girl's features. Margaret, how old is Jessica? 17. Why? Because she looks exactly like Sarah did at that age. Margaret's face went pale. That's impossible. Sarah didn't have any other children. But Jake was thinking about the timeline, about when Sarah had left the foundation and what might have happened to her in the months before she was placed in a new facility. What if Sarah did have a child? What if that's why they tried to kill her, not just because of what she knew, but because she was the mother of one of their victims? The implications hung in the air between them like a storm cloud gathering strength. If Jessica was Sarah's daughter, then Emma had a sister she'd never known about. And both girls were in danger from people who had spent decades perfecting the art of making children disappear. Margaret clutched the photograph to her chest. "We have to find her. Jessica went missing 3 days ago. She was supposed to check in with me, but she never called." Jake felt the familiar surge of determination that had driven him to follow Ranger into that abandoned farmhouse. Another child was missing. Another family was being torn apart by the same people who had killed his wife and tried to steal his daughter. But this time, he wasn't going into the fight blind. This time, he knew who the enemy was and what they were capable of. And this time, he had allies who understood that sometimes the only way to stop a monster was to drag it into the light where everyone could see what it really was. The silver locket felt warm in his palm as he followed Detective Chen and Margaret Foster out of the house. Sarah had left him clues, breadcrumbs, leading to a truth that stretched back decades. Now it was up to him to follow that trail to its end, no matter where it led or what it cost him. Some fights were worth everything you had to give. The police badge was buried 3 feet down in the basement of the Whitmore farmhouse, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath what had once been the foundation of an old root cellar. The forensic team found it while searching for additional evidence, and when Detective Chen showed it to Jake, his world shifted on its axis once again. Badge number 1247, issued to Officer Michael Torres in 1995. The same Michael Torres who had been Ranger's first partner. The same Michael Torres who had supposedly died in the line of duty 6 months before Jake adopted his dog. "Chen," Jake said, staring at the tarnished metal in his hands. "If Torres's badge was buried in that basement 30 years ago, then he didn't die 6 months ago." "No," she said quietly, "he didn't. Officer Michael Torres was killed in 1995 while investigating the Millbrook Children's Foundation. His death was covered up, and someone else has been living under his identity ever since." The pieces of the puzzle that Jake had been trying to assemble for weeks suddenly clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The man who gave me Ranger that wasn't the real Torres. We believe he was working for the trafficking network. His job was to monitor you, to make sure you didn't get too close to the truth about your wife's death. But something went wrong with his plan. Agent Torres, the woman from the FBI, not the imposter who had given Jake his dog, spread a series of photographs across the conference table. They showed the fake Torres at various points over the past several years, always in the background of important moments in Jake's life. At Sarah's funeral, standing among the crowd of mourners. At Emma's school play, sitting in the back row. At the courthouse during Jake's DUI hearing, watching from the gallery. "He'd been following your family for years," Agent Torres explained, reporting back to his handlers about Sarah's activities, her research into missing children cases. When Sarah got too close to exposing the network, they decided she had to be eliminated. Jake felt sick. And after they killed her, they sent this man to watch me, to make sure I didn't start asking the same questions she had been asking. Exactly. But giving you Ranger was a mistake. They thought a retired police dog would just be a pet, a way to gain your trust and stay close to your family. They didn't realize that Ranger's training would lead him straight to evidence they'd been trying to hide for decades. Detective Chen pulled out another file. The real Michael Torres was getting close to uncovering the trafficking operation in 1995. He'd identified Judge Harrison as a person of interest and was building a case against several prominent community members. But before he could present his evidence, he disappeared. They killed him and buried his badge with him. "We think so," And then they brought in someone to take his place, someone who could monitor the investigation from the inside and make sure it never got too close to the truth. Jake thought about the man who had handed him Ranger's leash, the man who had spoken so convincingly about Officer Torres's dedication to helping children. It had all been an act, a performance designed to make Jake trust him. But there was something else bothering Jake, a detail that didn't fit with the rest of the story. If this fake Torres was working for the traffickers, why did he give me a dog that was trained to find missing children? Why take that risk? Agent Torres and Detective Chen exchanged a look. That's what we've been trying to figure out. Either it was an incredible oversight on their part, or what? Or the real Torres had trained Ranger specifically for this mission before he was killed. Dogs can be taught to respond to very specific scents, to alert to particular locations. What if Torres knew he was in danger and programmed Ranger to lead someone to the evidence he'd hidden? The idea was almost too incredible to believe, but Jake was thinking about Ranger's behavior over the past months. The way the dog had always been drawn to the direction of the farmhouse, the way he'd broken free and run straight to the building where the children were hidden, the way he'd known exactly where to find the loose floorboards. You think Torres trained Ranger to find that basement? I think Torres knew he was going to be killed, and he turned his canine partner into a living piece of evidence. He trained Ranger to wait for the right person, someone who would follow up on what the dog found, someone who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. Jake looked down at the tarnished badge in his hands. But how did he know I would be the right person? Detective Chen smiled sadly. He didn't, but Sarah did. She pulled out one more document, a letter that had been found in the real Torres's apartment, sealed in an envelope, marked, "To be opened only in the event of my death." The letter was brief but devastating. If you're reading this, then they got to me before I could expose them. I've been working with a young woman named Sarah Henderson who escaped from the Foundation and has been helping me identify other victims. She's brave and smart, and she's not afraid of them like the other survivors are. Sarah is planning to start a new life somewhere safe, but she's promised to keep watching for children who need help. If something happens to me, Ranger knows how to find the evidence I've hidden. Sarah says there's a man she's met who might be worthy of that responsibility someday, someone who understands what it means to protect children and fight for what's right. I don't know if she'll marry him or if he'll end up in Millbrook, but she seems certain that when the time comes, the right person will be in the right place. She says, sometimes the universe has a way of putting broken people exactly where they need to be to fix something that's been broken for much longer. Jake read the letter twice, his hands shaking. Sarah had known. Even before they were married, even before Emma was born, Sarah had known that someday he might be called upon to finish what Torres had started. She chose me, Jake said quietly. She married me and moved back to this town knowing that someday I might need to do this. It looks that way, Agent Torres said gently. Your wife was playing a very long game, Mr. Rourke. She spent her adult life preparing for the possibility that the network might resurface and threaten other children. And now they have Emma. The words hung in the air like a curse. Despite all the precautions, despite the protective custody and the federal agents, Emma had been taken from her safe house 3 hours earlier. The kidnapping had been professional and precise, no witnesses, no evidence, no demands, yet. But Jake knew what they wanted. They wanted him to stop investigating, stop asking questions, stop following the trail that Sarah and Torres had laid out for him. They wanted him to choose between justice for hundreds of missing children and the life of his own daughter. We'll find her, Detective Chen said, but Jake could hear the doubt in her voice. No, Jake said, standing up from the conference table. I'll find her. Because that's what I was chosen to do. He looked around the room at the federal agents and detectives who had been working this case, at the evidence boxes and crime scene photos that represented decades of horror and corruption. Ranger and I are going to finish what Torres started. We're going to find every missing child, expose every corrupt official, and shut down this network permanently. And we're going to bring Emma home." Agent Torres started to object. "Mr. Rourke, you can't handle this alone. These people are dangerous, and they have resources." "They have resources," Jake interrupted, "but they don't have what I have." "What's that?" Jake picked up Ranger's leash and looked down at the dog who had led him to this moment. "They don't have a partner who was trained by someone who gave his life to stop them. They don't have the evidence that a dead cop spent months hiding from them. And they don't have the love of a woman who spent 20 years preparing for this fight." He headed for the door, Ranger at his side. "Most importantly, they don't have a father who will burn their entire world down to get his daughter back." Detective Chen called after him. "Jake, where are you going?" He turned back with a smile that held no warmth. "I'm going to pay a visit to Judge Harrison. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what happened to his granddaughter." The badge of the real Michael Torres felt heavy in Jake's pocket as he walked toward his truck. Behind him, he could hear Agent Torres coordinating with local law enforcement, setting up surveillance and contingency plans. But Jake wasn't interested in contingencies anymore. He was done with careful investigation and proper procedures. His daughter was missing, and the people who had taken her were about to learn what happened when you threaten the family of a man who had already lost everything once. Some lessons, Jake thought as he started his truck, were best taught in person. Ranger's service medal lay on the dashboard of Jake's truck, catching the afternoon sunlight as they drove toward the Harrison estate. The bronze star, with its faded ribbon, had been hidden in a compartment of Ranger's old transport crate, another gift from Officer Torres that Jake was only now beginning to understand. The medal was engraved with more than just Ranger's name and service dates. On the back, in letters so small they were barely visible, was an address, 1247 Millbrook Heights Road, the Harrison family compound. Jake pulled over to study the medal more carefully, and as he turned it in his hands, he realized it wasn't just a commendation. It was a key, literally. The medal's central star could be separated from its mounting, revealing a small electronic chip embedded in the metal. When Jake plugged the chip into his phone, it unlocked a series of files that made his blood run cold. Security camera footage from inside the Harrison estate, financial records showing payments to trafficking networks across 3 states, and most damning of all, a video recording of Judge Harrison discussing the disposal of children who had become too much of a liability. Officer Torres hadn't just been investigating the trafficking network, he'd been gathering evidence from inside their operation. Somehow, he'd managed to plant surveillance equipment in the Harrison compound and document their crimes in real time. But the most shocking revelation was in a file labeled Insurance Policy. It contained detailed plans for taking down the entire network if Torres was killed. Names, locations, bank account numbers, safe house addresses, everything needed to destroy the organization that had operated with impunity for decades. And at the center of it all was a map showing the current location of Emma Rourke. Jake's hands shook as he studied the blueprint of a warehouse on the outskirts of town. Red X's marked guard positions, escape routes, and holding areas. But it was the timestamp on the file that made Jake realize the full scope of what Torres had accomplished. The map had been updated 3 hours ago, automatically generated by tracking devices that were apparently still active in the Harrison network. Torres had turned Ranger into more than just a search dog. He'd made him into a walking intelligence operation. The medal wasn't just a memorial, it was a command center that had been running covertly for years, waiting for someone to activate it. Jake's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Detective Chen. "Jake, where are you? We've got teams in position around the Harrison estate, but we need you to wait." Sarah's wedding ring felt smooth and warm against Jake's finger as he barricaded the office door with filing cabinets. He'd put the ring on before entering the warehouse, needing something to connect him to her strength and her love for children who couldn't protect themselves. The alarms continued blaring, and Jake could hear heavy footsteps moving through the warehouse toward their location. Through the small window in the office door, he saw 3 armed men spreading out to cover the exits. "Emma, I need you to help me," Jake said, kneeling beside his daughter. "Remember the emergency games we used to play at home? This is like that, but more important." Emma nodded, her green eyes bright with fear but also with trust in her father. "What do I do?" "I need you to help me take care of the other children. Can you do that?" Jake looked around the room at the 19 other children who were huddled together, ranging in age from kindergarten to high school. They looked at him with the same mixture of hope and terror he'd seen in the faces of the 12 children from the basement. The older girl who had been protecting Emma stepped forward. "My name is Rachel," she said. "I've been here the longest. What's your plan?" Jake appreciated her directness. "The police are coming, but we need to stay safe until they get here. That means staying quiet, staying together, and doing exactly what I tell you to do." Through the window, Jake could see one of the guards talking urgently into a radio. The man was clearly receiving instructions from someone, probably Judge Harrison or whoever was running the operation now that the Harrisons were in custody. Wait. If the Harrisons were in custody, who was giving orders to the guards? Jake's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Send the children out alone, and you live. Try to be a hero, and everyone dies." Another text followed immediately. "You have 5 minutes to decide." Jake showed the messages to Rachel, who read them with the grim understanding of someone who had seen too much for her age. "They're lying," she said quietly. "They killed the last person who tried to help us escape." "What happened?" "A woman who worked here tried to get some of the younger kids out 3 months ago. She said she couldn't stand it anymore, that she was going to call the police. They told her the same thing, send the children out, and she could go free. And..." Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. "They shot her in front of all of us. As a lesson." Jake felt a cold rage building in his chest. These people didn't just hurt children, they traumatized them by forcing them to witness violence against anyone who tried to help. But the ring on his finger reminded him of Sarah's strength, of her belief that broken people could fix broken things if they refused to give up. "Rachel, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm not like the other adults you've met. I'm not going anywhere without all of you." Jake's phone rang. "Detective Chen." "Jake, we're 2 minutes out. Can you hold your position?" "We're locked in an office with 20 kids and 3 armed guards between us and the exits. I don't think holding position is going to be enough. The tactical team is moving into position now. Whatever you do, don't try to engage the guards. Let us handle them." But even as Chen spoke, Jake could hear the guards moving closer to the office. One of them was testing the door handle, finding it locked. "Hey!" a voice shouted from outside the office. "We know you're in there. You've got 30 seconds to open this door before we come in shooting." Jake looked around the office space, searching for another way out. There was a window that led to an alley behind the warehouse, but it was small and would require the children to climb out one at a time. Too slow and too exposed. Then Ranger did something unexpected. The dog moved to the corner of the office where a large air vent was mounted near the ceiling. He sat down and looked at Jake with the focused attention that meant he'd found something important. Jake followed the dog's gaze and realized what Ranger had spotted. The air vent was large enough for children to crawl through, and according to Torres's building plans, it connected to a service tunnel that led to the parking lot. "Rachel, can you get the smaller children up to that vent?" She looked at the vent, then at the youngest children in the group. "Maybe. But what about you? I'll be right behind you." It was a lie, and Rachel seemed to know it, but she also understood that their options were limited. The sound of power tools came from outside the door. The guards were cutting through the lock. Jake boosted the first child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 6, up to the vent opening. Rachel climbed up after him, then helped pull the other children up one by one. Emma was one of the last to go. As Jake lifted her toward the vent, she grabbed his face with her small hands. "Daddy, are you coming with us?" I'm going to try, baby, but if something happens to me, I need you to remember something. What? I love you more than anything in the whole world, and Mummy loved you too, and we both know you're brave enough to take care of yourself, no matter what happens. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. I love you too, Daddy. Jake kissed her forehead and pushed her up into the vent, just as the office door exploded inward. 3 men with assault rifles burst into the room, expecting to find 21 hostages. Instead, they found Jake Rourke standing alone beside an empty filing cabinet, with Ranger at his side. "Where are the children?" the lead gunman demanded. Jake smiled, and there was something in that smile that made all 3 men take a step back. "Gone," he said simply. "Safe. Beyond your reach forever." "You're lying. There's nowhere they could have gone." "You'd be surprised what children can accomplish when they have someone who believes in them." The lead gunman raised his rifle, pointing it directly at Jake's chest. "It doesn't matter. You're not leaving here alive anyway." But before the man could pull the trigger, the warehouse lights went out. In the darkness that followed, Jake heard the sound he'd been waiting for, the coordinated entry of federal agents through multiple access points. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, and voices shouted commands in the professional cadence of law enforcement taking control of a crime scene. "Federal agents, drop your weapons. Get on the ground now." The gunfight that followed lasted less than 30 seconds. The 3 guards were outgunned and outmaneuvered by agents who had trained for exactly this kind of hostage rescue scenario. When the emergency lighting came back on, Jake found himself surrounded by FBI agents, with Detective Chen kneeling beside him, checking for injuries he didn't realize he'd sustained. "Jake, are you hit?" He looked down and saw blood on his shirt, but he couldn't feel any pain. The adrenaline was still coursing through his system, keeping him focused on the only thing that mattered. The children. Did they get out? Agent Torres appeared beside him, still wearing her tactical gear. All 20 accounted for and safe. They're being transported to the hospital for medical evaluation, but they appear to be unharmed. "Emma? Emma is asking for you. She told the paramedics she wasn't going anywhere until her daddy was okay." Jake tried to stand, but discovered that his legs weren't quite ready to support him yet. The gunshot wound in his shoulder was beginning to make itself known as the adrenaline wore off. "Mr. Rourke," Agent Torres said gently, "you need medical attention. But before the paramedics take you, I wanted to tell you something." "What's that?" "Officer Torres, the real Officer Torres, would be proud of what you did today. You honored his sacrifice and finished what he started." Jake looked down at Ranger, who was sitting calmly beside him, despite the chaos of the crime scene. The dog's presence had been a constant source of strength throughout the entire ordeal, and Jake understood now that he'd been carrying the spirit of Torres with him all along. "Agent Torres, there's something you need to know. This warehouse isn't the end of the network. There are other locations, other children being held. Torres left us a complete map of their operations. We know. We're already coordinating raids on 17 other facilities across 3 states. By tomorrow morning, we're going to shut down the entire network." As the paramedics loaded Jake onto a stretcher, he kept Sarah's ring pressed against his palm. She'd chosen him for this mission before she'd even known it was a mission. She'd seen something in him that he hadn't seen in himself, the capacity to fight for children who couldn't fight for themselves. The warehouse around him was filling with federal agents and evidence technicians, beginning the process of documenting crimes that stretched back decades. But Jake's focus was on the future, on the children who would go home to their families, on the ones who would be placed in loving homes, on the possibility that Emma would grow up in a world where monsters like Judge Harrison couldn't hurt innocent children. Some fights, Jake thought as the ambulance pulled away from the warehouse, were worth bleeding for. The new leash was military-grade paracord, strong enough to hold 150 pounds and rated for tactical operations. Jake had bought it at the same sporting goods store where he'd purchased his rescue equipment, but it represented something much more important than just a better way to walk his dog. It represented his commitment to never let anything important slip away from him again. 3 weeks after the warehouse rescue, Jake sat in the federal courthouse watching Judge Harrison's sentencing hearing. The man who had once held absolute authority over family court decisions now sat hunched in an orange jumpsuit, listening to victim impact statements from survivors who had waited decades for justice. Margaret Foster spoke first, her voice steady and strong as she described the systematic abuse and trafficking that had operated under Harrison's protection. Then came the adult survivors from other facilities, each one adding their testimony to the mountain of evidence that had brought down the entire network. But it was Lucy Morrison, the real Lucy Morrison, now cooperating fully with federal investigators, who delivered the most devastating testimony. Judge Harrison didn't just enable the trafficking, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He was one of the primary customers. He and his wife used their positions in the child welfare system to identify vulnerable children, then arranged for those children to be placed in facilities where they could be accessed for abuse and eventual sale to other buyers. Jake watched Harrison's face as Lucy spoke, but the man showed no emotion, no remorse, no shame, no recognition of the lives he'd destroyed. He sat like a man who believed he'd simply been unlucky enough to get caught. But the real satisfaction came when Agent Torres read the charges against the wider network. 47 arrests across 3 states, 16 facilities shut down, and most importantly, 83 missing children recovered and reunited with their families or placed in legitimate care. 83 children who were alive because Jake had followed his dog into an abandoned farmhouse. Emma sat beside him in the courtroom, coloring in a notebook, while the adults discussed the details of crimes she was too young to fully understand. She'd been remarkably resilient in the weeks since her rescue, seeming to take strength from the knowledge that her father was a hero who saved children. "Daddy," she whispered during a break in the proceedings, "when I grow up, I want to help kids like you and Mummy did." Jake smiled and smoothed her hair. "I think that's a wonderful idea, sweetheart." The sentencing phase of the trial took 2 days. Judge Harrison received life in prison without the possibility of parole. His wife Margaret received 25 years. Lucy Morrison, in exchange for her cooperation, received 15 years with the possibility of parole after 10. But for Jake, the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the children who were going home. The 12 children from the original basement rescue had all been placed with loving families or reunited with relatives who had never stopped looking for them. Rachel, the brave teenager who had helped Emma escape from the warehouse, had been accepted into a specialized program for trafficking survivors and was planning to study social work in college. And then there was Jessica. Margaret Foster's intuition had been correct. The teenager was indeed Sarah's daughter, born during the chaos after Sarah's escape from the Millbrook Children's Foundation. DNA tests had confirmed the relationship, which meant Emma had an older sister she'd never known about. The reunion had been careful and gradual, supervised by counselors who specialized in helping families navigate complex trauma. But the bond between the sisters had been immediate and strong, built on their shared determination to protect each other and their mutual love for the father who had risked everything to save them. "Mr. Rourke?" Jake looked up to see Detective Chen approaching his seat in the courthouse gallery. The detective had been promoted to lieutenant in recognition of her work on the case, and she'd been instrumental in coordinating the multi-state investigation that had brought down the network. "The Harrison estate is being liquidated," Chen said. "The proceeds are going into a victim compensation fund, but there's something else you should know. They found a safe in Harrison's study containing documents that go back 40 years. Financial records, photographs, correspondence with buyers. It's going to take years to identify all the victims and all the perpetrators, but we're going to get them all." Jake nodded. "What about the other children, the ones who didn't make it out?" Chen's expression grew somber. We've located burial sites on 3 different properties owned by shell companies connected to the network. So far, we've recovered the remains of 31 children spanning 4 decades. They're all getting proper burials now, and their families are finally getting closure. It was justice, but it was the kind of justice that came too late for too many victims. Jake thought about Sarah's letters, about her nightmares of children who had disappeared in the night. She'd been right to be afraid, right to spend her life looking over her shoulder. But she'd also been right to believe that broken people could fix broken things if they refused to give up. After the sentencing, Jake and Emma drove to the memorial garden that had been planted where the Whitmore farmhouse once stood. The community had come together to create something beautiful from the sight of so much horror: flower beds and walking paths, benches where people could sit and remember, a playground where children could be children without fear. At the center of the garden was a simple stone monument listing the names of all the children who had been victims of the trafficking network. Sarah's name wasn't on the list she'd survived, but Jake knew she would have approved of the memorial. Emma ran ahead to the playground, while Jake and Ranger walked the memorial paths. The new leash felt good in his hands, strong and reliable. Ranger seemed to understand that their mission was complete, that the children who could be saved had been saved, and the people who had hurt them were facing justice. But as they walked, Jake noticed something interesting. Ranger's attention was drawn to a section of the garden where construction was still ongoing. Workers were installing a new monument, this one dedicated to the adults who had given their lives trying to protect children. Officer Michael Torres's name was at the top of the list. Jake approached the monument and saw that someone had left fresh flowers at its base. A small card was attached to the bouquet, and when Jake read it, he felt a familiar warmth in his chest. "Thank you for giving us Ranger. Thank you for trusting Jake to finish what you started. Your sacrifice saved more children than you could have imagined." The survivors. It was signed by Margaret Foster, Rachel, Lucy Morrison, and dozens of other names that represented decades of pain, but also decades of resilience. Jake pulled Officer Torres's service medal from his pocket and hung it on the memorial. The bronze star caught the afternoon sunlight, just as it had on the dashboard of his truck during the most important mission of his life. "Rest easy, partner," Jake said quietly. "The job is done." Emma came running back from the playground, her cheeks flushed with excitement and her hands dirty from climbing on the equipment. "Daddy, can we come back here tomorrow? I want to show Jessica the garden when she visits." "Of course we can, sweetheart. We can come here anytime you want." As they walked back to the truck, Emma slipped her hand into Jake's. "Daddy, do you think Mummy knows what happened? Do you think she knows that you saved all those kids?" Jake thought about Sarah's letters, about her belief that the universe had a way of putting the right people in the right place at the right time. He thought about how she'd chosen him, chosen this town, chosen to trust that someday he would be ready to fight the battles she couldn't win alone. "I think Mummy knows," he said. "I think she's proud of all of us." The new leash swayed gently in the evening breeze as they loaded into the truck. Jake looked back at the memorial garden one more time, thinking about the children who were safe now and the ones who would never be forgotten. Some stories, he realized, didn't really end. They just transformed into new beginnings. The framed photograph sat on Jake's mantelpiece, catching the morning light that streamed through their new living room windows. It showed 3 faces smiling at the camera: Jake, Emma, and Ranger. Taken on the day they'd moved into the house that Sarah's life insurance and the Victim Compensation Fund had made possible. But there was a 4th presence in the photo that couldn't be seen: Sarah's spirit, woven into the fabric of the family they'd rebuilt together. 6 months had passed since Judge Harrison's sentencing, and Jake's life bore little resemblance to the desperate struggle it had been before Ranger broke his leash and ran toward destiny. The foundation Jake had started in Sarah's memory, the Sarah Henderson Foundation for Missing Children, had become a national organization, funded by donations from people who had followed the story and wanted to help protect vulnerable children. Emma was thriving in her new school, surrounded by friends who knew her father as the hero who had saved dozens of children rather than the town drunk who couldn't keep a job. She'd started a pen pal program with some of the survivors from the trafficking network, writing letters that helped both her and the other children process their experiences. And Jake had found something he'd thought was lost forever: purpose. "Daddy, come quick," Emma called from the kitchen. "Ranger found something in the backyard." Jake smiled as he walked toward the kitchen, remembering how those same words had once filled him with dread. Now they usually meant that Ranger had discovered a tennis ball or an interesting stick, nothing more dramatic than the everyday adventures of a retired canine enjoying his golden years. But when Jake looked out the kitchen window, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. Ranger was sitting perfectly still beside the garden shed, his body language indicating that he'd detected something significant. "What do you think he found?" Emma asked, pressing her nose against the window. "I don't know, sweetheart. Let's go see." They walked outside together, and as they approached the shed, Jake could see what had caught Ranger's attention. A young girl, maybe 12 years old, was crouched behind the building. She was dirty and frightened, wearing clothes that had seen better days. Jake knelt down so he was at the girl's eye level, remembering everything he'd learned about approaching traumatized children. "Hi there," he said gently. "My name is Jake, and this is my daughter Emma. Are you okay? Do you need help?" The girl looked at him with eyes that held too much knowledge for her age. "Are you the man who saves kids?" she asked in a whisper. "I try to help when I can. What's your name?" "Maria. I escaped from a place where they were keeping me and some other kids. I walked all night to get here because someone told me you might help." Jake's blood ran cold. Despite all the arrests and facility shutdowns, it seemed the network wasn't completely destroyed. Or perhaps new organizations had risen to fill the void left by the Harrison operation. "Maria, you're safe now," Jake said firmly. "No one is going to hurt you anymore. But I need to call some people who can help us find the other children. Can you tell me where you escaped from?" As Maria began to share her story, Jake realized that his mission wasn't over. It might never be over. There would always be children who needed protection, families who needed hope, monsters who thought they could operate in the shadows without consequence. But he also realized that he was ready for whatever came next. The broken man who had struggled to get out of bed each morning was gone, replaced by someone who understood that his pain had been transformed into purpose. An hour later, Detective Chen, now Lieutenant Chen, arrived with a team of federal agents. Maria's information led to the discovery of another trafficking operation, this one operating out of a series of mobile homes in a different county. By nightfall, 6 more children had been rescued and 3 more perpetrators were in custody. As the sun set over Millbrook, Jake sat on his front porch with Emma and Ranger, watching the normal life of their neighborhood unfold around them. Children played in yards that were safe. Parents called them in for dinner without fear. The world wasn't perfect, but it was better than it had been. "Daddy," Emma said, leaning against his shoulder, "are you going to help Maria and the other kids?" "As much as I can, sweetheart. That's what we do now. We help kids who need help. We help anyone who needs help. That's what Mommy would have wanted." Emma was quiet for a moment, then pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. It was another of her drawings, but this one was different from the family portraits she usually created. This drawing showed a long line of children holding hands, with Jake and Ranger leading them toward what looked like a house made of sunshine. "I drew this for Maria," Emma said, "so she knows she's part of our family now, like Jessica is." Jake looked at the drawing and felt the same warmth in his chest that he'd experienced when he first read Sarah's letters. His daughter understood something that many adults never learned. Family wasn't just about blood relations. It was about the people you chose to protect and love, the ones you refused to abandon, even when it would be easier to walk away. "That's beautiful, sweetheart. I think Maria will love it." As the stars came out over Millbrook, Jake thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. He'd started as a broken widower, facing the loss of his daughter, convinced that his life was spiraling toward inevitable failure. But somehow, through a broken leash and a dog's determination to follow his training, he'd discovered that his greatest losses could become his greatest strengths. The memorial garden where the Whitmore farmhouse had once stood was visible from his front porch, its lights twinkling in the darkness like earthbound stars. Tomorrow, Jake would visit Officer Torres's monument again, leaving fresh flowers and updating the fallen cop on the latest children who had been saved. But tonight, he was content to sit with his family and watch the peaceful evening unfold around them. Ranger dozed at his feet, a faithful guardian who had led them all toward their destiny. Emma worked on her homework, occasionally asking for help with math problems that seemed far simpler than the complex equations of justice and mercy that Jake dealt with in his foundation work. And somewhere in the gentle evening breeze, Jake could almost feel Sarah's presence, proud of the man he'd become and the children he'd helped save. The framed photograph on the mantelpiece would remain a symbol of their new beginning, but Jake knew it was just the first picture in what would be a long album of memories. There would be more children to save, more families to reunite, more monsters to drag into the light where they couldn't hurt innocent people. But there would also be simple moments like this one, when a father and daughter could sit together in safety, surrounded by the love that had survived every attempt to destroy it. Some stories ended with justice served and villains defeated. But the best stories, Jake thought as he kissed Emma's forehead goodnight, ended with hope for tomorrow and the knowledge that love was stronger than any force that tried to tear families apart. The broken leash that had started it all hung in a frame beside Sarah's photograph, a reminder that sometimes the things that break us are exactly what we need to set us free. As Jake tucked Emma into bed that night, she asked him the same question she'd been asking for months. "Daddy, do you think we'll help more kids tomorrow?" And for the first time since Sarah's death, Jake's answer came without hesitation. "I hope so, sweetheart. I really hope so." Outside their window, Ranger settled into his favorite spot in the backyard, alert even in sleep to any sound that might indicate someone needed help. The dog's vigil would continue through the night, just as Jake's mission would continue through all the days and years to come. In the end, that was what family meant, standing guard over each other's dreams and being ready to answer the call when someone needed saving. Some purposes, Jake realized as he drifted off to sleep, were worth a lifetime of service.